I'm John Barclay, and welcome to the Fatality Free Future podcast.
Hello, my name is Holly Ferguson. This is the podcast where we explore the challenges and possibilities of creating a fatality-free future. Today, we're joined once again by HSEQ professional Alan Stevenson to discuss identifying SIF exposure. How are you doing, Alan?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
How was your last week or so?
I had a trip to site and then, of course, a lovely long weekend, which I enjoyed. So, yeah, it's been a busy couple of weeks.
Plenty more stories in your pocket ready to go?
I think so, yeah. I've just got to try and remember the ones that I've already told.
No, we're happy to hear them all again. So, Alan, I'd like you to help us today step through a process to go through in defining a SIF event in an organisation context, and where can we start with doing that?
I think for me, so there's always been sort of two aspects of doing classifying an event, right? There's the actual outcome and then there's the potential outcome. And some organisations can tend to focus on the actual outcome without really exploring, well, if the next control failed, what is a realistic, and this is sometimes always the quandary that people have, the realistic potential for it to be more severe. So investigate it as is, actual damage, actual injury. However, look at, did it realistically have a potential to be more serious? And if it did, how more serious could it have been realistically? And we can rely on experience and industry information. There's lots of places that we can go to hopefully help us make that realistic assessment. But it's an assessment at the end of the day. There might be a little bit of science behind it, but it's really your assessment based on experience and having conversations with other people. And this is where the discussion around, well, what actually happened, the bit of tell me the story. So you want the story from someone about what happened, how it happened. How did we get to this point? There was an example recently on one of the sites that I visit where there was certainly the potential for a heavy vehicle to breach a barrier, which could have, because there was nothing else left, they'd breached the final barrier. And the projection was that this vehicle then had the potential to fall off an open edge, right? And in this particular industry, there's been lots of examples where individuals have died when a vehicle has somehow gone over an open edge and fallen, and one or two people have died, right? So that was a very, very clear one, and that sort of shook this particular site and this particular organisation up quite a bit. So it's that kind of thing, Holly. So I think, to answer your question, there's the actual, there's potential, and then there's the realistic potential, because people throw their arms in the air and go, well, every incident's got the potential to be a fatality. Yeah, maybe so, but realistically.
And that's where a lot of the conversations used to happen, especially around the traditional Heinrich and Berg triangle, is, well, a paper cut, if it gets infected, you can keep going, what if, what if, but I think that's the key part we're learning now. It's got to be realistic. You've got to look at previous examples. Unfortunately, there's enough fatality data out there around the world, and I think just about, if not every scenario or every type of work or every type of energy has been contributing to that. So there's enough information really, if you want to assess it properly, for you to actually go and understand what is the potential of that.
Dig into it a bit more,
Yeah, and I think you're right. There's so much energy goes into the actual that we probably don't necessarily put enough thinking or curiosity or interest into what was the actual potential.
Yeah. And sometimes people don't want to go there, right? Because as soon as they go, this was a potential serious event where someone could have been seriously injured or killed, head office are going to get involved, and there's going to be all sorts of people.
That's some of the things we've had conversations with leaders about, right? Depending on what the rating of that potential is, can trigger a certain level of work. And and a certain level of follow-up, and everyone's extremely busy, and sometimes, the level of expectation of work and follow-up can prompt people to maybe not give it the potential that it should have. It's not just about, we've rated the actual and, we've got an opportunity to rate the potential. That needs some checking, that actually that actually needs, because most organisations I've worked with do that. But you know what? I've seen examples where the potential is actually lower than the actual. So it's, well, how's that possible that this actually happened? So it can't be any lower than that from a potential point of view. So I think the key part there is, are you doing that? Are you actually looking at not just the actual but the potential? And if you are looking at the potential, are you looking at the effectiveness and the quality of what's happening there?
Yeah, then you get into an organisation's ability to do quality investigations and all. So there's all sorts of things that fall out of it. But my experience sometimes be, not going to go there. There's going to be someone on the plane crawling all over me, or even in the legislative world, the regulator. If I report it this way, then the regulator's going to get involved, and then you go, well, wait a minute, if you don't report it and then the regulator finds out, then that's a whole world of pain that you don't want to be in.
Correct.
Yeah, so let's narrow this down. We're saying you, I, we, organisation. Who is actually doing this work?
Oh, that's a big question. So who is doing the work of deciding?
Defining a SIF event.
Yeah. So again, the work that we do, we see many examples of a document that sort of tries to define and put some parameters around incident reporting and investigation, various ways to title these documents. So they try to do it. I saw one quite recently, which was 37 pages. 37 pages long.
Oh, what's the ideal length?
I don't know, a dozen maybe for something that complex, but they try to wrap in so much into this document. And the request from this particular organisation was, we're finding that senior leaders on site are not following the procedure. So then you look at the procedure and you go 37 pages and you go, wow. Then this incident that I mentioned about the potential breach, there was nothing left. What if? And this was, potentially a serious injury and fatality situation. I then went and read through the document to try and understand, well, if I'm the senior person on site, how would I decide if this is a serious injury fatality event or not? And I have to admit, I find it quite difficult to follow the process, and part of it didn't sort of make sense. So to answer your question, Holly, the expectation is it's going to be, the more senior people, whether it's a health and safety superintendent, manager, project manager, whatever you want to call them on site. It's their role to reference this document and then make a decision via a flowchart, a table, whatever it is, to decide what happens, what they do next regarding this particular incident. So usually it's at that level, and then sometimes it will be head office. They wake up on a Monday morning and see this stuff, and then they're on the phone and they're wanting to know what's happened. So lots of people get involved, and I think that's where then there's a lot of energy wasted in discussing.
Yeah.
Well, is it that?
Isn't it?
If we classify it as a serious injury fatality event, oh my goodness, I've got to go and see the COO or the CEO, so there's all sorts of stuff that gets in the way of this stuff happening. But it's usually the more senior people on site that have to refer to the procedure, the management system document to make the decision, the initial call, and then stuff happens after that. There's a whole domino.
What happens when we're working with contractors? That must add another layer of complexity.
How long have you got?
Go on. Well, we can make that a whole podcast episode.
Yeah.
So my whole career, I've been a contractor. I've worked for contracting companies. I've worked for contracting companies who have contracted, who have subcontracted, right? So I've sort of been sometimes the meat and the sandwich, whatever you want to call it. So usually the contractor has an obligation to comply with your management system. And by reference, our management system, if I'm the principal contractor, needs to reflect what the client says in all of this. So when you get to the contractor management piece, sometimes it's interesting. So again, the reference point is, sometimes when we're on site representing the principal contractor, with the client saying, well, you're on site, so we want you to operate under your management system. Not always the reality. Because the client then has an obligation to report to the regulator, and they have their own management system, and usually they're aligned.
Yeah.
And sometimes they will be involved in the classification, right? Because it has an impact on them and their relationship or their reporting to the regulator, right? Because usually they're in charge of the operation, so they're the primary PCBU. So they then have to report to the regulator about what's going on, what's happened on site, especially if it's a reportable or a serious injury and fatality event. So being the contractor is a pretty tricky place to be navigating that whole world of reporting and investigating and all of that.
Yeah, because it goes to, even when we're talking before, just about people coming in, they look at it, they want to have a say on it, they want to have input to it. And I think that's one of the challenges for contractors. They've got that going on internally themselves, but then they've also got then their client or their primary contractor that they're working for also wanting to have input on that as well. And I guess the challenge of that is however that's been set up contractually. Like say if they're being asked to run under their own system, you have a reasonable assumption that they're going to do that work and they're going to have their own classification and they're just going to inform you of that process. But reality sort of kicks in a bit there because there's still an obligation for the primary contractor or the client to have a role in that. So, again, they are going to get involved. And it, depending on what that relationship's like, that can be a really good collaborative learning process. Sometimes it can be a little bit about protecting ourselves. And I think that's the complexity here. This all really works on the level of the relationship and trust that has between different people. And the most extreme example of that is when the conversation or the focus shifts to the classification rather than what happened, is the person okay, what can we do differently, what are we learning, what have we learned to try and prevent this happening again, but it gets more into the classification. And I've seen that become really, really messy. That becomes about that. Just another quick example. Recently, someone had a finger injury. They were wearing high-impact gloves. They were trying to load a drill stem onto a drill, something that they'd done quite a lot, right? But this piece of drill stem's about 45 kilograms. So they had, as I say, high-impact gloves on. They were trying to load this drill stem. Something's happened. It didn't quite go as it's gone before. It slipped and it crushed. They had a minor crush injury to two fingers. The right thing to do, so they got patched up, first aid, all the rest of it. The right thing to do was to send them off to hospital to get an x-ray to make sure there was no fracture, right? When they got to hospital, the treating doctor insisted on stitches, a couple of sutures, 2 or 3 stitches in this one wound that had split open. So there was an option, right? There was an option to put a couple of steri strips on or sutures. Steri strips would have meant that the injury wasn't classified in a particular way, but because they had stitches, then suddenly it's a medical treatment case and yada, yada, yada. And the client that I spoke to was more concerned about it being classified as a medical treatment case than first aid.
Do you know what I mean? So that kind of thing, there's still that legacy way of thinking that people get more focused on. Is the guy okay? Okay, a doctor had a look at them and said, yeah, I'm going to stitch it up. What can you do? What can you do? And that's a simple example of, focus on the classification rather than the learning, the experience, all of that.
And And while there's a lot going on at the moment around just the investigation process itself to be less fault orientated and learning orientated, and I guess we're starting to see pockets of that starting to happen, and we're starting to see again for the foremost approach it is about trying to find fault, and I think that becomes a little bit of an easier default when it's a contractor that's had the event. Because now we can just talk commercially. There's commercial requirements in here that you're not meeting, and I think that can stifle. Well, again, it can get back into the classification process. If we get the classification a certain way, then it doesn't impact our commercial arrangement with our client. Those sorts of things are just creating complexity and a distraction for me personally. When I say a distraction from what really matters, which is so what happened. How is everyone? What have we learnt? How do we prevent it again? Those to me are way more important. And to get that right level of curiosity and questioning going is when we talk about when I'm talking about classification, I'm just talking about, is it a serious injury and fatality potential or not? Based on whatever treatment someone gets, is what's the right treatment? I know that then determines whether it's a medical or a first aid or what. I get it. But, I think what we're trying to help organisations understand is don't get lost in that. Okay, this person crushed their fingers. Did it have a potential to be more than that? Did it have a potential to be a life-changing event?
Partial amputation or something similar. So, and again, it gets back to the realistic potential.
Correct.
And the controls that were in place to prevent it escalating.
Now, Alan, where do damaging energies come into this? You've brought in a model for us. Some might be very familiar with this, others might not be. Tell us a little bit about it.
So I think in one of the episodes you asked me about, where did my awareness of serious injuries and fatalities come from? And then I mentioned Chevron. We were doing some work for Chevron. And Chevron produced Preventing Serious Injuries and Fatalities Applying the Hazard Identification Tool, and it's now known as the Energy Wheel. And I think Chevron were, in my experience, one of the first organisations to use this and have a practical application in the field. So the Energy Wheel has 10, and it's been replicated. I've got another couple of documents here which replicate this Energy Wheel. So it's well known, and it looks at gravity as a source of energy, motion. Anything moving has a source of energy, which, if it's not controlled, could result in a serious injury fatality. And that's I like the way that it's structured. There's mechanical energy. That's things that are going round and round and up and down. And again, they have the opportunity to impact electrical energy, pressure, oil, air, whatever it might be, temperature, chemical, biological, radiation, and sound. So these are all sources of energy which, if they are not managed and controlled, and there is an uncontrolled release of one of those sources of energy, it could realistically result in a serious injury or fatality. So that's the essence of it. So Chevron produced this, I don't know, maybe more than 10 years ago.
20 years ago,
A long time ago. There's various versions of it, but what the three documents have brought in, so there's a gentleman called Matthew Hallowell, Dr. Matthew Hallowell, Canadian, and he uses the Energy Wheel. He's got a course and all that kind of stuff, but he uses the Energy Wheel because his concern is, and I think we've mentioned this previously, is that people are not able to identify all of the hazards in the workplace. Regardless of their experience, seniority, people miss things. So they're missing the hazard identification bit, so the rest of it doesn't really matter. If you don't see the hazard, you can't assess the risk, you're not going to have all the applicable controls in place, stuff will happen. And they use this acronym called STICKY, stuff that can kill you, STCKY. So this is all stuff that can kill you. Right, so that's the essence of it. So he talks about the art and science of energy-based hazard recognition. And then the other document I've got here is from the Construction Health and Safety in New Zealand. And they're replicating basically, so they've used Matthew Hallowell as a consultant on this process, and they're using exactly the same energy wheel. These uncontrolled release of one of these sources of energy has the realistic potential of causing a serious injury or fatality.
Key part coming up here is damaging energies. They relate them then quite quickly from an energy source to hazardous state, or identifying them as a hazard.
Yep.
From your experience, so when you go out and look and have conversations with leaders and teams out there, I mean, I've got my own experience in this as well, but how often do you see this language versus non-hazard energy language?
They sort of, I think, John, for me, I tend to hear, and I think this is how people have been conditioned, because the conversation for many years now has been critical risk, right? So then you talk to people about what's going on in the workplace, and they're having a conversation about risk, right? Which is okay.
Yep.
But then I'll take them back and say, okay, so tell me about the hazards that are in the workplace that means that someone might be at risk, right? So I take them back to tell me about the hazards. So I'm sort of taking them back to the energy wheel.
Yep.
Right? Because sometimes, and then I get these quizzical looks. What do you mean? But the default is, I think, because of the condition, right? Or even critical controlled field verification. Right, so they've gone to the control.
Yeah.
So we're not necessarily having a conversation about the risk or the hazard, but you start with the hazard, then you have a conversation about the risk, then you have a conversation about the controls. But sometimes we're just having a conversation about the controls without necessarily understanding the risk. And for me, it's about understanding, right? So the understanding bit is missing. Unless you know what are these sources of, what are the hazards, the 10 things on the hazard wheel give you a good place to start. And I like the Chevron document because they talk about hazardous energies, but then they've got examples of confined space, electrical. So they then talk about the various potential significant hazards. So there's just one here, confined space. They've got various hazards listed
within
from the hazard wheel, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So just the activity of entering a confined space, they have identified
6 damaging energies.
6 damaging energies. So does everybody doing a confined space entry understand that those are the hazards? So understanding is important.
And I think that's the bit we're starting to really notice, that you'll hear people rattle off confined space, confined space, confined space. So someone says, so what's a hazard in your work today? Oh, we're working in a confined space. And there's an awareness piece there for me, and a fundamental knowledge and skill that sits in there. Like I say, within a confined space, there could be potentially 6 energy sources.
Just in this example, yeah.
Just in that example.
Yeah.
Now, depending on the confined space, there might only be 4.
Yeah.
But for me, what's missing, especially when you start to have these conversations out in the field, beyond just, there's a sign and there's some barricading and there's ventilation, ticking all these controls are present.
Yeah.
When you actually start talking to people about the hazard and actually about the energy sources in there, you do get that blank look to, well, it's the confined space, and I've mentioned confined space.
Yeah.
But what's the energy source? What's the actual hazard in there that's going to harm you?
Yeah.
And I think that's the bit we have an opportunity here to get better at. And I think that's still one of the things missing in this whole SIF process that people are talking through is, they're still talking pretty much about critical risk and critical controls. And we've spoken a bit about, well, even that itself has challenges because we're not verifying the controls per se. They're just present.
Verifying the effectiveness,
But I love this. This is exactly the sort of conversations I don't think we're having enough of.
Yeah. And it's people in the front line. We said, it's the people in the front line that experience these serious injury or fatality events. And I sometimes have conversations with senior people on site, and it's been an ongoing conversation for quite a long time now around again, the injury pyramid and focusing on, we want people to be reporting hazards and all that. The more hazards we report, that old conversation that we know now doesn't quite stack up. So it's, and your question earlier, Holly, about, so what is it we want people to do, who should be doing it, all of that kind of stuff. So the conversation I often have with especially the more senior people on site, the superintendent management level, is about, and this is where they get a bit twitchy, right, is about your job is to be focusing on the serious injury fatality situation. That's your job. Oh, but what about the smaller, the twisted ankles and all that? Yeah. My experience is you pay attention to these serious injury fatality type events, then those smaller things will, through an organic process, reduce.
Yep.
If you focus on the smaller events, you're going to miss the serious injury fatality situations. So which one do you want to focus on?
Yep.
Which one's of most interest to you? That's a typical coaching question. Which one is of most interest to you? And they'll say, the serious injury fatality events. Okay, so what are you going to do now? What could you do now so that you're spending most of your energy, because you get a limited amount of energy to spend in your 12-hour, 13-hour, 14-hour shift? Where are you going to spend that energy? That's the best use of your time, the best return on your investment. What's it going to be? And they know, intellectually they know. But then how can they enable others? But they get very concerned if they start doing that. They're going to take their eye off the ball and the smaller stuff. Yeah. Don't be too concerned about the smaller stuff. It's upsetting. It's not nice when it happens. However, you get people focused on what I'm really interested in, you not being seriously injured or killed, then they will begin to pay attention themselves on the smaller stuff.
And we've discussed the stats around this a few times, that those smaller events that aren't serious are coming down, but the fatalities are staying at the same rate.
Absolutely. Yeah. And again, it's just, where are people spending their time? And then, it's a bit of a cyclical conversation. They get the client going, why is this a medical treatment case? It could have been a first aid case. And what's the big deal?
Yeah. We get lost in the detail.
Yeah.
Lose focus of what's most important. And I think we've mentioned this quite a few times, in that
Mm.
those high frequency, low consequence events create a lot of distractions and a lot of energy for not just people but the whole organisation. About
massive.
What was the treatment? How come we did that treatment?
Yeah.
That led to this classification. That now means I've got this happening.
Yeah.
And we get all just by that on its own. I've now taken all my critical attention away from high damaging energies with fatality potential to trying to work out why someone gave stitches and not tape. Again, I get it. I understand why those things happen.
I totally get it.
But I still think it's a great opportunity.
It is. So, I have those conversations with the more senior people on site. The other stuff will get taken care of. Your supervisor, your frontline workers, all the rest of it. Still have those conversations because, they're still the ones that are getting injured. But for you, if I was in your seat, this is what I'd be paying attention to.
I'm already imagining that this episode could be titled Tape Not Stitches.
That would be a good title.
Yeah.
Thank you so much once again, Alan, for joining us on the Fatality Free Future podcast.
Brilliant.
And we're going to get you back in for another one.
Thank
So
you.
we'll see you very soon.
Brilliant. Thank you, Holly. Thank you, John.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Fatality Free Future podcast. Head to our Fatality Free Future hub on barclays.com for more information and to access everything we spoke about in this episode.